Yep, I'm Alex Kotlun. I'm going to be giving a talk about web components. Um, I'll just give a brief introduction to myself. So I'm somebody who has a master's degree in software engineering, and so I actually work in cybersecurity, but we do sometimes analyze code. And I actually graduated from an apprenticeship. One of the courses actually that we took was a web maintenance course that actually Megan taught, and so that's actually part how I found out about this meetup. And so do sometimes tutorials with JavaScript in my free time. Partially how though I came across this topic was I remember 2 meetups ago that when we were talking, and so actually Michael Abriola, who we were talking about, was bringing up web components and how they are something that could become very big in the future. And so it's sort of, or I never heard of web components as necessarily like a formal term. But so I kind of understood and just sort of be like widgets, which we kind of know that, but there was also a more specific framework for that. What are web components? So it's a group of APIs, standards, and technologies that are used for creating custom HTML elements. It was first introduced as at a conference in 2011. It is something that can be used with other frameworks. One YouTube I saw online was where he used actually a specific web component with React for helping create a specific event. Since web components were introduced, there's been a whole number of libraries that build off web components, Polymer and Bosonic, particularly Polymer, have very specific web components that they use. Just again, web components, they're a group of APIs, standards, technologies that are used to create very specific HTML elements. Again, it was first introduced at a conference back in 2011. It can be used with other different frameworks. So the example I mentioned was somebody using a web component with React for a specific event that they were creating. And so there's also been different libraries since it was first introduced that build off web components, particularly Polymer. That's one that especially uses web components and very specific ones. So the different parts of a web component, one of the biggest is that a web component has what's called a shadow DOM, which is its own document object model that allows it to have its own encapsulated or in structure, because a lot of times what happens is that depending on how you use CSS or styles, that can be affected, or some of the internal components can be affected by the external CSS. So Shadow DOM helps encapsulate that and keep that its own object. So custom elements, so being able to design your own object. And for example, one example I saw online was somebody building a sort of a card that had an icon of like Bowser, and then being able to select emojis for how you react to like certain avatar. A template, so being able to define the HTML within the web component. Another particular feature is LifeCycle Methods, which I'll get into, but a a lot of times when, for example, when a certain element is attached to the object DOM or document object model, certain lifecycle methods are triggered that facilitates the change, and then HTML imports, which essentially allow you to take code from other scripts and then incorporate it into your own web component. So why web components? So, like I was mentioning, encapsulation allows you to organize HTML content within a single entity. And then again, because of the shadow DOM, you can have your own elements that are without being affected necessarily by an external CSS or style, for example. Compatibility, it can be used with a lot of different frameworks. Again, I mentioned with React how events can be customized using web components. Flexibility really gives you the ability to create an element of your own choosing. Standardization also allows you to be able to create a specific web component and use it in different environments or frameworks. And then increased use in enterprise. So this is one graphic that I found from Google Chrome developers. And so it shows here that how they've been developing their own web components. And so really over the past few years, they've created several thousand web components. So from 2015 to about 2019, about 16,000 or so. I remember also they were sharing an example with Salesforce, how they wanted to create their own web components. And they needed something that was portable, but also didn't necessarily need as much reworking or necessarily something where people really had to understand like the internals. So web components help them with that. So as I said, there are also LifeCycle methods that help facilitate the change. With web components, you have a main HTML page a lot of times, and then also a backend JavaScript where you define a class. Like any class, you define a constructor to initialize the data in there. And that's also a lot of times where you define the initial HTML for the component. A connected callback, so that's called every time when an element is inserted into the document object model. So a lot of times it's called first when the elements are first actually created, and then also if you add another element, that also gets triggered. There is disconnected callback, so if an element is removed from the object model, that gets triggered. And then there's also attribute change callback. So if an element's attributes gets modified or added, a lot of times there's a method called observed attributes that used to define like specific certain values, and then a lot of times attribute change callback will be called on specific values though that are defined in that method. So let me actually just open the page here. Should be open. Sorry, I haven't used Teams for a presentation like this. We use it at work, but okay, there we go. So here's example of a web component that I created. Actually, I guess it's doing a second time. So, what I have here is essentially where you have a number of different values, or in text boxes where you input a value and then that gets added. So what I decided to kind of do as a kind of like an example here. So imagine like if we had a bunch of different charities and then like how much you would contribute for that. So example, put like one here, $10 here. 15. So then it summarizes all the money that's added up, and then I'll just and then I also have the ability here to add different charities. So for example, let's say support. Or 60, so then that adds it up there. So to show you the code here, so this is the main HTML page where I have this defined here. So this is an HTML element called num add list. So it has a title here, which so this is the title of the component here is specified right here. Initial number of list items here are specified, and then so support JavaScript, support Angular, support React, support Node, support Vue, and then text to also add for adding a different item. So I put add new charity. So this is the front end HTML page, and then this is the back end JavaScript. So as I mentioned a lot of times, how this works is that they're defined initially using a class. So this is called num at list, and a lot of times they extend a class called HTML element. And then a lot of times what happens is they're created using custom elements, and then define what the HTML tag will be called, and then the class name. So yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a constructor here, which I also mentioned how there's a shadow DOM. So a lot of times you have a shadow variable, or at least where it says this dot attach shadow, and then that allows you to access the different objects contained within the shadow DOM model. A lot of times it also relies on, to create the elements, use document.createElement and then assign that as a variable. So here are some attribute values that I get from get methods. And then this is where you'd find the HTML template. First, main div container, and then some formatting for the icon. And then this also, so what you have here is a class item list that makes it easier to reference the list of items. And so what this does is the items are referenced to a, well, actually, sorry, I should say there's a get items which take, or so what this does is it gets the list items with attribute or list item, and then packs them into, or contains them into an array where that's returned. So then this list item dot map then maps them into specific items. So, and then each input item has a class called numText field, which allows it to be referenced. So, in part, so here are some of the methods that we use for event listeners. This one's for adding a list item here. So this has an event E, which then first this takes elements that have a class add new list item input, and then making sure that the value isn't null. It'll create a element that has li, which is a list item. So then it also then creates an input element. And so then, so this is taking the input text value here, and then adds, or so when the element is created, then the class then adds a class numText field, and then it adds an event listener. So this is the event listener when I type in a number. This is what listens to it. And then this then is where it officially appends the child to, or appends the element to the list. But here's also one of the big methods here, connected callback, which is, again, when an element is first attached to the document object model. So this includes like when first the elements are created. So for example, or so this references a lot of the different text fields, and then also this is reference to the add element button. This adds the number, so this adds the listeners initially when the initial text fields are added, and then this also adds, or so this also is when you click the add event button. So this one right here, it adds an event listener, so that add list item is referenced when I do that. And yeah, also as I mentioned, there are get methods for getting certain attributes, so like the title, this returns the title attribute. And then here's also the method that I use for summarizing the different values here. So I have one main method here, update sum total, where this selects the element that has a paragraph in it, where this contains the total, and then this has the sum total method. So it takes the elements that have class numText field. So then it goes through the values and then parses them and then returns them as a total here. So yeah, that's how this total gets summarized up, and then that's how the numbers get added. So another attribute that we might add is, for example, if we want to add like a prefix here. So this would be in case to denote a $sign. So what we can do then is add a prefix attribute here. And then we'll add a get prefix here. So then going up to the update sum total method here. So then we'll put just up where we have the okay, so you see here there's the $sign from it. So, yeah. So again, like so yeah, then it adds a prefix here. So then that's how it gets the prefix is again from this attribute here, so that allows you to define this, or you can define as part of a web component, and then with the class, then it gets that variable and then prints it on here.
Cool.
Yeah. So this is here. Developer. So here's some of the references that I get. This custom elements everywhere. From one of the YouTube's that talks about how like some of the ways that frameworks can be used with web components. This get up here, and then also developer.mozilla. That's where actually I found some code to play around for this for the tutorials that helped me build some of this code here. Then here are also just a number of other YouTubes. Cool. So I know that was a bit long-winded, but any questions?
We had time. And thank you, Alex. It's really appreciated that you put this together for us. It really is. Thank you very much, mate. But I am curious, why does a guy who's into security care about web components?
Well, partially, or part of my job is, or part of my background is in software engineering, and also part of my job is also analyzing code. So that partially, that's a part how we work with different web languages, but in part how I specifically came to talk about web components was a part because a few meetups ago, I remember Mike was talking about how how web components are something that are being increasingly used. And so I was kind of curious about that, and that's what kind of led me to do some research into web components.
Okay, so it's purely just as a general interest. It's not that, because I'd be fascinated if you were running security on web components. That would be really cool, and I'd want to know what you were doing, trying to break all of our stuff.
Well, one thing too that we do emphasize with cybersecurity is input validation, which, while I wouldn't say is strictly related to web components, that is something where I think, like, for example, making sure here that value isn't empty before making sure that, or before it tries to parse it. That's a very simple example of input validation. So again, not strictly related to web components, but also kind of a little bit where cybersecurity and JavaScript / web components comes in together.
That would be a very unique thing to talk about. Actually, no one's ever talked about how we break a web page from a cybersecurity perspective, and some of the things that the rest of us kind of don't think about and take for granted because we assume that somebody else is going to worry about security, right? I don't think any of us have ever. I don't think anyone's given a presentation on security around this. Have they, Joe?
Yeah, I don't think so. So yeah, that might be something interesting down the road.
Maybe different. Yeah.
Maybe that might be something to do in the future.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I will say, I've personally been following web components for a long time.
You're an old man.
At our second ever meetup, I gave a talk on web components, and I think there's only we didn't record it properly, so there's no screen recording. So there's like a video on my own YouTube channel because I just couldn't throw it away. But I declare in the video, like, you're totally going to be using this in the next year. And that was in October of 2016. And a lot has changed, but for the most part, it's like some method names have changed. I do think you talked about early on, you mentioned HTML imports. I think that was killed this year.
Yeah, or I think I was reading something that I think like Chrome, or I think they discontinued in like February. Something,
yeah,
but
it was
I have seen
recent.
It's still on like the W3C page, so that's in part why I still included it.
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, if you look at, a really good example is Vue. Like Vue, React to some degree, and I think Angular to some degree, the Angular 2 Plus, like they borrow heavily from the design of web components. Like especially Vue. If you look at Vue, it's like, I mean, there's some extra stuff in there, but it's borderline indistinguishable from web components. And they are cool, and they are already, one, they work in the browser, but they're always changing it. But at the same time, if you look at like a range input, that's been a web component in the browser since it started. I don't know if I think you have to turn on like some special flag in Chrome to see it, but when you inspect it, it'll have like Shadow DOM and a bunch of other stuff going on. So these things are with us already. We just start using them.
Cool. All right. Does anybody else have any questions?
So I wonder to Joe's comment. Yeah, I already said that. I'm an Angular guy. You meaning like parent and child relationship between the components, right? When you say
so I mean, like, again, it has its own like document object model where so you add or it has, or for example, like where I had like the list, there's one main, in that example, like there's a main class, and then there's a class for like the individual elements, but it used an element or a method called append child to add those elements. But the document object model, you do add elements to it, and then the editor is kind of its own entity.
Yeah, that's the thing. So usually, like in my experience, you would like I write them up myself, and like you would import the library, do some npm install, then you consume something. You can consume something. And the talks, other talks I heard also on the web components. I don't know. Like to me, I didn't hear like I wonder who has actual experience when you take somebody else's component, right? Bring in your application and just specifying all inputs, outputs that right you specify.
So you're talking about like when somebody else uses somebody else's web component, or
yeah, that stuff. I wonder if because I didn't have to do it, so I wonder if anybody ever like consider just an experience of
so I'll confess I maybe could have probably researched that a little bit more, but I mean, so like for example, that or I mentioned how there's one person who used with React actually a very specific version called Preact to create a specific event. But also there is the one thing I also mentioned here. There's a website called Custom Elements Everywhere that creates or it has different ways that frameworks interact with web components. So, actually, if you want, I can bring that up. Or
yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, that's another bringing to the topic, like the question of Mark. Maybe why did you choose that? Were you you're actually examining that component that you're going to use in your application, right? That's and that would be also interesting to hear, like how do you do that? Looking at the components and just using your tools to see what vulnerability.
So you're talking about like how you use
because if you're security, you're looking for vulnerabilities, right? That's for sure. Yeah. So that would be pretty interesting to see how you examine those web components to say like, yeah, they're okay to use in this application, but or you would say no, we're not using them because there is that.
You're all good. Yeah, so Howard just posted in the chat, if you could get the references and let Joe have them, then we could post them with the videos as well. That would be really helpful.
Sure. Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Or so are you So with the references, do you want me to just send that like in a separate document, or?
Yeah, if you and also Eric have a way to share your slides, that would be super helpful.
Sure.
Typically, like if you can get it out somewhere, either like GitHub or whatever you want to use, and then add a link to the meetup comments, like for this specific event. There's a comment section on meetup.com.
Sure.
But then, yeah, we'll, as long as I have the link, we'll include it in the along with the video in the description.
Okay. But yeah, this is a page that shows like how different frameworks work with web components here.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, though, any framework, well, let's just, say the big ones, right? React, Angular, and Vue, and then you got a few stragglers. When you create the web component, you register it in the browser as a custom element.
Yeah.
Any framework can then output it and send it attributes.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, there's really nothing else to it. And then inside of the life cycle of the web component or the custom element, which I think they're starting to like rebrand it as custom elements, I think. You have a couple life cycle events, but probably like the key one is that attribute change callback. And that's it. It's like a watcher on the attributes. So you have your framework or plain JavaScript or whatever changing the attributes and the component responding to that. Just like a React component would re-render based on prop changes. Angular, I haven't done Angular professionally since Angular.js, but you'd have a watch. And then you inside of that web component in the creation of it, you can tell it which attributes to actually listen to. With that, I forget what it's called, Alex. Observed
attributes.
Yeah, so you give it an array of the ones that you specifically want to watch, and then when those change, just like the old school Angular watch, you get an old val and a new val, and you decide what to do with it. But you could drop any web component into React code, just like a regular JSX tag, or into Angular as a part of a template, and it'll just work.
Yep.
Like you don't have to do anything special with it. You treat it like a div or an input or a H1 or whatever. It's just you've created a new tag in the browser. And it's awesome.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it is.
All right. Any other questions? Oh, then thank you very much to Alex and Eric for speaking for us tonight. It was very much appreciated, guys. Really appreciate the time that you put into this.